Boom, shakalaka laka. Welcome back, you wonderful Patreons, to Patreon episode number 4. And I've started some previous ones with intro to 50s rock history or previous to 50s rock history. But today I'm going to go ahead in the timeline a bit because I spotted this book at the library called The Man Who Sold the World, David Bowie in the 70s, and the 1970s, rather. And I just flipped through it a few times before I have to sort of bring it back, and I might pick it up again. I'm not enough of a Bowie scholar to sort of hone in on what's sort of relevant to any given audience, whether they're Bowie fans or not. But I, as a person who has learned a few Bowie songs and knows a bit about Bowie, but has never done the deep dive, I mean, not even into the Berlin trilogy or whatever, I haven't gone, full bore into Bowie scholarship. Even as someone with that limited view, I found this little 2.5-page chunk very, very interesting and relevant to our ongoing narrative. It's called The Heart of Plastic Soul. And it says, White rock has lost its contact with the dance by straying too far from black beginnings. Black music is struggling to define its own integrity in the throes of new developments in the popular idiom, comparable to the bebop pioneer's impact on 40s jazz. Whatever next? I suggest black and white music. That was New Musical Express rock critic Ian MacDonald in 1975. For another voice, try Ron Ross from the U.S. magazine Circus. Any artist who will mean as much to as many in the 70s as the Beatles did in the 60s is going to have to involve black listeners in the same way Stevie Wonder or Jimi Hendrix involved whites. For the generation of white musicians who emerged in the mid-60s, particularly in Britain, black American music represented a touchstone of authenticity, a jewel that they could reproduce in paste but never hope to match. As American producer Tony Visconti noted in 1974, every British musician has a hidden desire to be black. They all talk about funky rhythm sections, and their idols are all black blues guitarists. Talking of Bowie, he added, he's been working on putting together an R&B sound for years. Like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, The Who, and many more besides, Bowie had set out in 1964 with the intention of sounding as if he had been born in Harlem, rather than pre-immigration Brixton. A decade later, he boasted, it's only now that I've got the necessary confidence to sing like that. That's the kind of music I've always wanted to sing. Not that one could have deduced from the music that he, or for that matter, the Beatles, the Stones, or The Who, had recorded between 1967 and 1970. All of those acts felt as if they had progressed beyond the need to imitate their black American idols. They were under more direct influences: psychedelic drugs, literature, radical politics, street protests, the decline of the traditional national identity. None of them lost their passion for R&B or soul, but they now inhabited what felt like a more complex universe, which the simple verities of the blues were inadequate to reflect. Instead, American soul music came to meet them. Alongside the rise of black nationalism and black power, the Black Liberation Army and the Black Panthers, performers such as Curtis Mayfield, James Brown, Marvin Gaye, and Sly Stone began to sketch vivid portraits of a black nation in revolt, under threat and forced to confront the starkest economic realities of the age. Only when the Black Liberation Movement was destroyed by covert government interference, the Nixon administration's infamous COINTELPRO initiative, the ghettos of America's cities were flooded with cheap heroin and cocaine, and the revolution of 1970 was repackaged as blaxploitation cheek in movies such as Shaft and Superfly, did the culture of U.S. soul slide back into escapism and hedonism, the righteous blast of funk giving way to the dance floor metronome of disco. That's a very simplistic overview, of course, which glosses over complex social transformations and political initiatives, and underplays the richness of America's black music during the early to mid-70s. It was the latter that attracted David Bowie when he moved to New York in 1974. He hung out at the Pierre Hotel ordering steaks that he never ate and $100 bottles of vintage champagne before heading uptown to the Apollo and downtown to Max's Kansas City, sampling the best of the era's sweet soul in Harlem, and an altogether more chaotic brew in the East Village. He wasn't alone in his obsessions. Mick Jagger, John Lennon, and Elton John were all about to welcome contemporary black American influences back into their music to disguise the hollowness of their closeted rock culture. But Bowie, ever the stylist at heart, was entranced as much by moves and fashions as by music. He fell for the cliched swagger of what Tom Wolfe, in an essay titled Funky Chic, called the Pimpmobile pyramid heel platform sole Prince Albert coat got to get over look of New Haven's Dixwell Avenue, in which all of them, every ace, every dude, were out there just getting over in the baddest possible way, come to play and dressed to slay. As Bowie recalled nearly 30 years later, it was an attempt to turn the visual around as well as the music. An escape route from his image as a space invader, his obsessions with political apocalypse, his hard rock cliches, his emotional repression, a reconnection with the body that he was already subjecting to torture by starvation and drug addiction, an expression of, there was no other word for it, soul. In the remainder of 1974, however, he channeled his soul obsessions into one tour that was meant to promote Diamond Dogs and one that clearly wasn't, and into a series of recording sessions whereby the strategies of contemporary black music enabled him to explore psychological terrain left untouched by his rock stardom. That was by Peter Doggett, the author of You Never Give Me Your Money, The Beatles After the Breakup, which we will dip into in this series as well. I think I've mentioned it before, but I plan to probably read selections from most of that book throughout the next year or so on this Patreon feed. It is a fantastic book because it is not about them after the breakup, actually. It's about them sowing their own seeds for breakup, attempting to break up, really breaking up, and then sometimes talking about maybe getting back together for decades. Or not so much them, like they're not talking about it actively in the public. They don't really cop to it, but there was some interesting spots in that timeline that surprised me, how often different members of the Beatles did get back together to do something, and then it definitely fell short of a full-fledged reunion. Oh, and you probably noticed I went a bit cheeky on the pronunciation of Space Invader. As it's fresh on my mind, I was just watching a documentary on YouTube about the history of video games, specifically the 70s and 80s. And I never really reckoned with the fact that Space Invaders was so insanely popular and smashed all these, sales records because of the fact that if you think back to what came before it and what came after it, it was the new standard setting game. I won't dwell on this long, but it's worth pointing out. Space Invaders was the first video game created where enemies could shoot back at you. It was the first video game created where you actually had a continuous background soundtrack going the whole time. And it was the first to create the sort of pattern whereby the closer you get to the end of a level, the more your enemies speed up and become more formidable. And it turns out, and just like in rock and roll stuff, that these kind of stories I love, because you find out, this whole thing happened because there was some weird technology that was actually used not for its intended purpose, or someone found a way to sort of, make this thing that became the standard out of some experimentation in a studio or something like that. Well, in this case, it was the fact that the processor in the game was having to work really, really, really hard to keep that many images of these aliens descending on you and like attacking you, to keep them all moving in the same formation and deal with the processing of the back and forth between your character and the aliens and stuff. Well, the more you take off the screen as you kill some of the space invaders, the more that frees up the processor it's like running in the red. If you imagine it as an engine, like if you had like a lot of wind resistance against a vehicle, you're pushing the gas to the floor, and then the wind goes away, and suddenly you're going from 50 miles an hour up to 75 miles per hour very fast. It was like that. Just that's why it gets so crazy at the end. And I guess the developers of the game were like, great, let's do that. Let's leave it in. Let's not fix that problem. It was also funny to me because like amplifier manufacturers rarely do this, but it has been done, and guitar pedal manufacturers rarely do this, but it has been done. To throw off people that are just trying to copy their circuits. The folks at Atari, because there was like multiple consoles being cranked out at the same time as the early Atari ColecoVision stuff, and they were just doing rip-offs of the same exact games, basically with a different name. And Atari started intentionally mislabeling the chips inside their machines and their cartridges so that anyone prying them open that would just go by what they thought the value of that chip would be building something with the wrong components. Which Dumble, an amplifier manufacturer that came up during the 80s, famously played by Stevie Ray Vaughan, and then after that caught on with him, then many others. Probably Eric Johnson helped a bit there too. Stevie Ray Vaughan's whole story I will get into. I'll have to, because I have a huge book that I haven't read. Someone gave me for Christmas 2 years ago called Texas Flood. And I haven't read a Stevie Ray Vaughan bio since 1990's Crossfire. Anyhow, the Dumble amplifier. Famously, the maker was so guarded of his circuit that he just filled it. Like once he finished wiring everything up and testing every single amp he made by hand, he would just fill the whole circuit board and head cavity area, whatever you call that, even if it's not a head, it's a combo amp, with like glue of some kind, or maybe epoxy, that kind of a thing. So you just couldn't even get in there and service, those parts of the circuit. Now, talking about Space Invaders makes me think about other things with like complexity and speed, things that create a sense of urgency, and I think it makes me want to listen to a little, some fast, complicated guitar playing, maybe some Dragon Force, heavy metal stuff like Dragon Force, yeah? That's the stuff. Sorry, it's not like hi-fi, but... Man, there's just something about that pattern in the verse that I like. That sort of, I don't know, the way he structured those lines of the verse. Kind of puts me in the mood, actually. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I'm not in the mood for something so intense. Maybe I want to get some like moody sort of country music vibe, but like a commercial country, like from the early 90s kind of a thing. Yeah, let's try, I don't know, let me shift gears into something like that, and a little something like this.
3:30 in the morning, not a soul in sight. The city's looking like a ghost town on a moonlit summer night.
Yeah.
Raindrops on the windshield, there's a storm moving in. He's heading back from somewhere that he never should have been.
Man, that sets a mood, doesn't it? I like how he structured that intro verse, though. I like the setup there, But also makes me think about another song, a more laid-back song, and maybe not so much dark and rainy, early 90s country. Let's go back to California. Let's get chilled out, Let's set the scene with a different kind of vibe.
On a dark desert highway,
There we go.
cool wind in my hair,
Oh, yeah.
warm smell of colitas, rising
I gotta admit, I really don't like this song very much.
up ahead in
I'm just
the
trying to make a point.
I saw a shimmering light.
If you're not
My head too heavy and my
if you're not quite there with me yet, I understand, but
stop for the
it's just one of those things when you listen to too much music, you start noticing patterns. So, so just to bury this point, like smash this point down, here's a quick recap of the and then we have for comparison
3:30 in the morning, not a soul in sight. The city's looking like a ghost town on a moonlit summer night.
Then we've got our original here.
on a dark desert highway, cool wind in my hair,
I just want to know who did this first
warm smell
in recorded music.
rising up
It's a great device. It's very effective, and it's smart, and it's cool, and it makes perfect sense that it would have been used through multiple generations, even if it's an unconscious homage. But I'm willing to bet the Eagles weren't the first to do it. The lot of the blues, of course, is that like I woke up this morning and I felt around for my shoes and I couldn't find them and I'm still broke, whatever. And it's cold outside or it's hot outside. But some establishing, here's the time of day. Here's the other atmosphere surrounding this time of day. And here's what I am doing, or here's what the protagonist of the story is doing. In the Dragon Force example, of course, it's cold winter morning. The surrounding atmosphere or context of that is it's the time before the light, and someone is riding towards the fight. And in the Garth Brooks, it's a stormy evening. The city is empty, is the surrounding context of that, and the protagonist is coming back from someplace. He definitely would be in trouble if somebody found out about it. And then obviously the Eagles version is it's warm and I'm in the desert, but there's cool wind and I can smell some weed because I am the protagonist. I am the narrator, but I, as the narrator of Hotel California, am about to expand into detail later. It's not as upfront with the action. You get told a lot in a short period of time in the Dragon Force and the Garth Brooks example. I guess that because of that, the Hotel California example, then it eases you in. It makes you want to be its friend and come along for the nice mellow ride until you get to the evil shit later on that you weren't expecting. Now let's go back to the voice of God, as far as this podcast is concerned. And that is the voice of Mr. Nick Tosches. We were only partway through his introduction of Unsung Heroes of Rock and Roll. Last time we were in those pages. Actually, we were further ahead talking about the song Rocket 88 with Jackie Brenston. And I will do my best to keep reading through this and not lose the plot in all the details about what singles were released on what, during what year, because that's a big thing with the explanation of the history of rock and roll from him and from Ed Ward and from countless other authors. But I'd say Tosches does it in a way that's more palatable and more energetic. There's no way to chronicle the history of rock and roll without getting really bogged down into the number of releases that came out in short periods of time. And that's sort of what made rock and roll, daddy. There was a need to feed the voracious appetite of people that were getting hooked on this very wild music. And there were now resources in the post-war era to make that kind of manufacturing blitz happen on albeit smaller scales with these independent record labels and such. So from where I left off, it is difficult to say precisely when the words rock and roll came to describe what was going on. The phrase itself is immemorial. It had been popular for its sexual connotations in the music of the 1920s. In the fall of 1922, blues singer Trixie Smith recorded a song by J. Bernie Bardore called My Daddy Rocks Me, parentheses with one steady roll, for Black Swan Records. Her record inspired various lyrical elaborations. Rock That Thing by Lil Johnson, Rock Me Mama by Ike Robinson, and so on. By the early 30s, rock and roll was more than a fuck phrase. It connotated a new sensuality of rhythm. The first inklings of that new style and spirit that were to overtake music a decade later. In 1931, Duke Ellington cut Rockin' in Rhythm for Victor. In Transatlantic Merry-Go-Round, an awful United Artists movie released in the fall of 1934, the Boswell sisters sang a song called Rock and Roll. Gladys Presley of Tupelo was pregnant that autumn, and believe me, the Boswell sisters' rock and roll was almost as bad as Bossa Nova Baby. In the 1940s, the phrase gathered momentum as the music gathered momentum. By 1944, the music of Nat King Cole Trio was being advertised as Royal Rock and Rhythm. In January 1947, a National Records advertisement for Big Joe Turner's Miss Brown Blues described its product as, this is all caps, groovy rhythm that really rocks. In a May 1948 ad for Brownie McGee's R&B tribute to the first black Major League Baseball players, Robbie Doby Boogie, Savoy Records exclaimed, this is also in all caps, it jumps, it's made, it rocks, it rolls. Roy Brown's Good Rockin' Tonight was released by Deluxe in September 1947. It was not a hit. Wynonie Harris re-recorded the song for King in December 1947. It was issued in February 1948. Slowly but surely, it ascended the race charts. No more Harlem Hit Parade for progressive Billboard. Ha ha ha. Way to go, Billboard. By June, it was number 1. After that, if it rocked, it sold. So in 1948, We Are Gonna Rock by Wild Bill Moore on Savoy. Rockin' Boogie by Joe Lutcher, Specialty. Rockin' the House by Memphis Slim for Miracle. And Rockin' Jenny Jones by Hattie Noel on MGM in 1949. Rockin' at Midnight by Roy Brown, Deluxe. Rock the Joint by Jimmy Preston, Gotham. Ooh, that's Gotham Records. If there was a label that you just like, if someone said, hey, I have everything they ever put out and you can have it for free. And here's three names. Savoy, Specialty, Miracle, or Gotham. Wouldn't we all pick Gotham? I think we would. All She Wants to Do Is Rock by Wynonie Harris on King, and Rock the House by Tiny Grimes for Atlantic. At first, the industry establishment did not quite know what to make of the new music. Reviewing Johnny Otis's record, Barrel House Stomp, in January 1949, Billboard, nonplussed, simply declared it to be one of the loudest records ever made. A few months later, when it reviewed Wild Bill Moore's Rock and Roll and Louis Jordan's Coleslaw, Billboard was valiantly but awkwardly trying to adjust. Moore's record was another frenetic installment in the pounding good rock serial. It's SERIAL, as if it's some sort of episodic, cliffhanger-laden, ongoing adventure story, this rock and roll. A potent new platter of its kind. In its finest remedial hep talk, Billboard said of Jordan's record, "Band really rocks." A month later, the term race was forsaken for the cooler rhythm and blues. In 1950, the real flood began. I'm Gonna Rock by Connie Jordan, choral. Sausage Rock by Doc Sausage, regal. Rockin' the Blues by Pee Wee Creighton, modern. Rock With It by Johnny Moore's Three Blazers, RCA Victor. Rockin' Rhythm by Pee Wee Barnum, Imperial. We're Gonna Rock by Cecil Grant, doing business as Gunter Lee Carr, Decca. Rockin' with Red by Piano Red, RCA Victor. Rockin' Blues by Johnny Otis with Mel Walker Savoy. And how about Rocking With Me by Piney Brown Apollo? I felt like the only way to just read that list, that entire full paragraph list, was just to keep rising in pitch, hopefully, so you wouldn't fall asleep. By now it was obvious what was going on was more than a serial, as Billboard had called it in the spring of 1949. Reviewing Connie Jordan's choral recording of I'm Gonna Rock in 1950, Billboard whined that it was the upteenth variation on Good Rocking Tonight. By 1950, people. 1950. The music journalists were sick of rock and roll. Take that to anyone who says Elvis or Little Richard or Chuck Berry invented rock and roll. Nobody invented rock and roll. It's just not one of those things you can pin down. Those three guys are gods. No question. Let's see. The trade publication was at the same time becoming astute enough to notice that the record in point did not have the real Gone spirit. In 1951 came Rock Little Baby by Cecil Grant, Decca. Let's Rock a While by Amos Milburn, Aladdin. Rockin' and Rollin' by Little Son Jackson, Imperial. And Rock H-Bomb Rock by H-Bomb Ferguson for Atlas. 1951 was also the year that Little Richard's first record, Taxi Blues, was released by Victor, and that Bill Haley began covering R&B hits, Jackie Brenston's remarkable Rocket 88, and the Griffin Brothers' Pretty Baby for Dave Miller's Little Holiday Records Company in Philadelphia. In 1952 came Haley's version of Rock the Joint for Essex, Rock, Rock, Rock by Willis Gatortail Jackson, Atlantic, Rocking on Sunday Night by the Trainiers, OK, that's spelled O-K-E-H, Rock Me All Night Long by the Ravens from Mercury, We're Gonna Rock This Joint by the Jackson Brothers, RCA Victor, and Rock, Rock, Rock by Amos Milburn by the Years End. There was even a Rockin' Records company in Los Angeles. There had been a Rock It Records in Baltimore in 1948 and 49, but it did not last. In 1953 came Rockin' Is Our Business by the Trainiers. Trainiers? I hope I'm not messing that up. On OK. Rock Me by Lucky Joe Almond, trumpet. Easy Rocking by Sam Butera, RCA Victor. And Rock Me Baby by Johnny Otis, Peacock. By 1954, rock and roll dominated the music industry. Many of rock and roll's first generation, several of whom are the subjects of this book's chapters. Roy Brown, Cecil Grant, Wynonie Harris, Louis Jordan, Amos Milburn, and others were already over the hill, dead or forgotten. A new breed dominated the early 50s. Their sound was less raw, more commercial. As it overwhelmed the marketplace, the industry could do nothing but bow to it. The Dominoes' 60-Minute Man had crossed over from the R&B to the pop charts in the summer of 1951. Bill Haley's Crazy Man Crazy had been a top 20 pop hit in the spring of 1953. In 1954, G by the Crows and Shaboom by the Chords and Hearts of Stone by the Charms were all top 20 pop hits. Alan Freed's first East Coast dance concert, held at the Newark Armory on May 1st, 1954, drew more than 10,000 people. His late-night WINS radio show was the rage of New York in calling the music rock and roll, though he certainly was not the first who had done so. He was only the most influential of those who had. Freed had rinsed the Dixie Peach from its image, rendering it more agreeable to the palate of the greater public. Big Joe Turner's masterpiece, Shake, Rattle, and Roll, shook the ground that spring, summer, and fall. The major companies were paying now for their sins, looking askance for too long at rock and roll, thinking that it was a passing trend, nothing more than the cereal that Billboard had called it. They began to see exactly how much money they had been missing out on since the late 40s. All the best-selling rock and roll hits, all the biggest artists, had belonged to those mongrel labels. As 1955 began, the major labels tried desperately to cash in on rock and roll, since they really did not understand what rock and roll was. The maladroit rushing of their greed was ridiculous to behold. Columbia decided that Tony Bennett would be its rock and roll star. Here it comes in all caps. Take the craziest! He swings! He rocks! He goes! Bennett's Close Your Eyes was pushed as an astounding, all caps, rhythm and blues rendition. Needless to say, Tony didn't make it as a rock and roll star. RCA Victor's proposal was more absurd. Dig Perry in action. Dig Perry in action on a great rock and roll record, implored the January 1955 ads for Perry Como's cover version of Gene and Eunice's Kokomo. But no one was laughing at RCA Victor a year later. 1954, the year of rock and roll's ascension, was a quintessentially American year all around. It was the year of the first atomic-powered submarine, the Nautilus, and of Senator Joseph McCarthy's televised hearings into the communist infiltration of the United States Army. It was the year in which RCA introduced its compatible colored TV, and in which the United States Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. It was the year that TV dinners were nationally marketed for the first time, and that Carter Wallace Laboratories gave the country its first tranquilizer, the Milltown. It was the year that, speaking of tranquilizers, the Muzak Corporation came into being. And it was the year that 19-year-old Elvis Presley made his first records, reworking country, rhythm and blues, and pop songs for Sam Phillips's Little Sun label in Memphis. His first Sun record, Mystery Train, was released on September 1, 1955. It hit number 1 on the country charts. On November 26, Presley, who by then was under the general management of Tom Parker, one of those colonels who understood fried chicken, signed a 3-year-plus options contract with RCA Victor. At his first RCA Victor session, held in Nashville on January 5th, 1956, Elvis recorded Heartbreak Hotel. Released in February, Heartbreak Hotel quickly rose to the top of both the pop and the country charts, and at the end of the following month, it crossed over to the R&B charts, where 15 years before, in the days of the Harlem Hit Parade, it had all begun. Elvis may well have been the most important figure in rock and roll. But had it not been for those who came before him, there would have been no rock and roll. It is primarily to those, the ones who came before, that I wanted to give homage in this book. Some of them were famous, some of them were not. Some of them were brilliant, some of them were fools. Many of them ended like Longfellow's Belisarius. I have words I'm going to have to look up. Sorry, folks. Begging for bread beneath the very arch of their triumphal march. Others of them prevailed. Most of them made music as fine as any that has ever been heard. Furthermore, they made it first, in the context of their time, when tradition was still a force, and the mass media had not yet taken to propagating changing styles as a means of propagating themselves. A great many of these characters were far more shocking than the most diligently outrageous new rock acts of today. The grand illusion of newness is popular culture's greatest sucker's racket. To begin to see that there really is nothing new under the lucky old sun is to begin to understand the nature of popular culture and the business of fame. This is important. As the fellow in the TV Guide commercial says, watching television is becoming more complicated every day. The chapters in this book, each of them devoted to a single artist or group, have been arranged to loosely follow the drift of time. I have begun with Jesse Stone, who also is known as Charles Calhoun because his career had spanned much of the century, from minstrelsy to swing to rhythm and blues to present-day rock and roll, and his story lends perspective. A chronology at the end of these chapters attempts to place the evolution of rock and roll in its larger historical setting. Finally, a comprehensive discography serves to chronicle the recording careers of the various characters involved. These discographies can also be used as a guide to obtaining the actual music itself. They can even be read, for the song titles alone, as a documentary of slangs, and sometimes subliteracies, progress in modern America. I spoke before of giving homage. This homage is not always of the most pious sort, nor is my sense of history of the most orthodox variety. If I can live with these things, so can you, gentle reader. I have tried to have a little fun on the side here, and I hope that what I have written will be read by those more inclined to laugh than to flinch at a bit of license taking, which, after all is said and done, really is what rock and roll has always been about. Last time on the Patreon episode, we had a bit from Spin Magazine's 1995 year in review survey of their readership. And we didn't finish it yet. We are on the second and final page now. And I will just read these through and then read if there's a note afterwards from the editor or whoever put it together. I will read that. I'm not saying. And then it says, etc., etc. Here's the answers under the category. Excuse me, it took me a while. I haven't watched an awards show in a million years, so I forget how to speak about these sorts of things. I don't know anyone that still talks about the Oscars or the Grammys or the Emmys or anything. So the category of music trend that should die. Number 1, rap. Number 2, punk. Number 3, country. Number 4, grunge. Number 5, retro. And that's 1995. I mean, this is before the garage rock resurgence, that we experienced in the late 1990s. This cancels, let's see, that pretty much cancels out everything except Hootie. Most overrated artist or band. Here we go. Green Day, number 1, then Hootie and the Blowfish, then Hole, then Pearl Jam, and Michael Jackson. Hootie comes in second? Most underrated artist or band. Hole, then Sonic Youth, Rancid, Bush, then Marilyn Manson. MTV's most annoying person / show. Number 1, Kennedy. She was annoying even then. Even then. Well before she moved on to other endeavors. Then Singled Out. I avoided that one like the plague, I can tell you that. Very obnoxious, very bro-y, very douchebaggy. Idalis. Don't recall her. All, number 4, and 5 is Jenny McCarthy. With adept appearances on both Dream On and Star Trek Voyager under her belt, Kennedy could end up the one MTV evacuee who avoids a glittering infomercial future. Not by much. Sex God or Goddess of 95. Here we go. Trent Reznor, Courtney Love, Brad Pitt, Alicia Silverstone, and Drew Barrymore. Best film, Pulp Fiction. Kids. Wow. Then Clueless, Dangerous Minds, and Interview with the Vampire. And that will lead into the next part. Best film actor or actress. Brad Pitt, number 1. Number 2, Tom Hanks. Number 3, Drew Barrymore. Then Jim Carrey. Then Sandra Bullock. Best TV show. Friends. My So-Called Life. The X-Files. The Simpsons. And Seinfeld. See if you just given dweebs a chance. ... Best TV actor or actress. Claire Danes from My So-Called Life. Dave Duchovny. Obviously, X-Files, Michael Richards from Seinfeld, Jerry Seinfeld, and then Roseanne. Loser of the Year, Michael Jackson, Courtney Love, Pearl Jam, O.J. Simpson, Green Day. Next year will be better, Michael. Next year, they'll build a statue for you. Biggest sellout. Number 1, Green Day, Pearl Jam, Courtney Love, Michael Jackson, the Rolling Stones. Yeah, the Stones really sold out their long-held punk ethics by letting Microsoft use Start Me Up, didn't they? Voice of Our Generation, number 1. Kurt Cobain, number 2. Nobody. That's pretty good right there. You could stop. Number 3, Eddie Vedder. Number 4, me. Number 5, Courtney Love. Thanks to the interns who made this poll possible. And then a list of people. And then below that, there is a little text box that's called Voices in the Crowd. And it says, the individual given the task of analyzing our annual readers' poll results usually lives in fear of the barrage of jokers who look upon the best artist category as a license to goof. I know. How tragic. Sure enough, some class clown cracked himself up, scribbling, I'm pretty fond of Salvador Dali. O'Keeffe's pretty cool. Of course, there's Van Gogh and Bosch. Okay, you come up with a better name for this category. Because another year of this, and some subscribers are going to be receiving prank phone calls at inopportune moments. Elsewhere, many of you refuse to allow yourselves to become constrained by the poll's 12-month parameters. Digging deep into the entry forms, we found nominations for Depeche Mode's Music for the Masses, Aerosmith's Love in an Elevator, and for Best Film, Some Kind of Wonderful. More contemporary categories left you cold. The voter who filled in the Best Rap Artist box, the best rapper is on a Trojan, was not alone. Neither was the person who responded to Best Techno Artist with, "Don't know, I've only heard of Moby." The don't knows held sway over the Best Online Music Site vote as well, although one brown noser who plumped for Spin Online wrote, "I haven't seen it yet, I just assume." A considerably healthier response greeted the most overrated and biggest sellout sections, both of which became the sole property of Green Day. One voter used his space to make the pertinent observation, "I don't know who it is, but it isn't Green Day." The people who vote them biggest sellout are the ones who bought Dookie. The sellout category also attracted this notable response, "Elastica fans, the idiot ones, not me. And we can distinguish you by..." The music trend that should die category attracted some heated responses. None, however, were more plaintive than this. Alternativeness being a fashion show. Oh, damn it. Sorry, I read that wrong. I thought that was going to be like leading to something else. The answer was alternativeness being a fashion show. In my school, if you don't dress perfectly alternative, you're considered a poser. But I don't have any money for all the cool clothes, and I've listened to the music longer than anyone. As terse as that was whiny as is this answer. Sorry. As terse as that was whiny is this answer. Listening to, playing, watching, even acknowledging Pearl Jam or Eddie Vedder. But can we dream about them? For Sex God Goddess, a reader panted, "This guy I know named Norm Kemble. Don't be surprised if he wins. He's hot." Possibly the most contentious section of the poll was Voice of Our Generation. Many of you asserted your individuality. Me, Eve Speece. Some bemoaned the lack of collective vision, while others were more specific. Dave Perner, "The music sucks, but everything he says makes sense." The girl in Boston that got me stoned at Hendrix's grave. Okay, that wouldn't make any sense because Hendrix was born here in the Pacific Northwest. And that was a regular thing for lots of us in high school to go to the grave and bring some, whatever you call that really thin paper where you can rub pastels on it and charcoal. I had a charcoal rubbing of Hendrix's grave in my bedroom in the 90s. He's been moved to a whole big deal in that same cemetery though now. I think there's a structure of some sort. You know, I haven't been there because I'm not a sellout. Just kidding. Another one, strangely, the people who put together the Livin' in the 90s CD collection. One respondent smirked MTV, then panicked. "Just kidding. I'm not serious. Do not count it." For me, though, the closest thing to a voice of a generation came from the reader who scribbled, "Like you all really care what I think," at the top of her form and closed it, moaning, "As if you're ever going to read this." Credit to Jonathan Bernstein. Now let's throw to a little Guess That One-Hit Wonder with a real sex god, a real voice of a generation, Gilbert Gottfried.
Here's one that everybody knows, and I know you will.
Oh my God! When I die and they lay me to rest, gonna go to the place that's the best. Gonna go to the...
Sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I die and they lay me to rest, gonna meet a guy named Jesus.
Yeah, that's it.
And when I die and then
Now, you know what?
Going up to the place that's the best.
You got it.
Gonna go to the spirit in the sky.
Very good. Very good.
That's where I'm gonna go when I die.
That's it.
Now, lest any of you are disappointed in the Patreon because it doesn't feature as much movie talk, I will carry on with this little segment with Frank Santopadre and Gilbert and whoever the third guy is that's about to speak right now regarding this song.
What do we have about
best use of that in a movie, in my opinion?
What was it?
The movie Contact.
Oh,
Did you see
Contact. The
You know-
Robert Zemeckis movie. Yeah.
There's these one-hit wonders. They only charted once, but so many of them come back in movies as like a huge,
Oh, yeah, or
huge
TV
thing. And they probably
commercials.
make more money when they're in the movie than
Oh,
they did
yeah.
their first time around.
Yeah. And what you'll appreciate most about the artist is Norman Greenbaum,
Yes,
which means...
singing about, a Jew singing about Jesus.
What do we know about Norman Greenbaum, Paul?
Let me see what I can find.
April 18th, 1970, it came in at number
I got
3.
one fun fact about him.
Let's hear it.
Greenbaum.
Let's hear it, Frankie.
He is not Italian.
No, he's
Surprising.
He's from Gilbert. He's from Gilbert's Drive.
I would have sworn he was from Palermo.
Why must you malign my people?
When they do such a good job.
While Paul's looking,
Go to the next one. 'Cause
these were okay. Well, these were
there are a lot of greenbounds in Wikipedia.
Yeah. You can't find Norman.
All right. I know you'll love it when I throw to Gilbert. There's only so many of those in the future. If you hate it, don't worry. It's gonna be slowing down. There was only so many free episodes of that podcast that I could download where they do the one-hit wonder sections. So, keeping with the movie talk, something I found today on archive.org while I was looking around for interviews with Penelope Spheris was a trailer for a movie called Dudes. And it stars Flea from the Chili Peppers and John Cryer, who was in plenty of movies, I think in the mid to late 80s, and eventually obviously went on to be one of the leads in 2.5 Men. It was directed by Penelope Spheris. I'm going to have to do something about that eventually. I'm going to have to cover that. The problem is I was already going to cover Suburbia. I've been planning to for years. I watched Suburbia on a weekend marathon on Shout Factory TV's website or their YouTube channel at least a year and a half ago. It was all movies curated by Patton Oswalt, who's one of my favorite comedians. And I have to admit, it must have been close enough to the pandemic that I was in kind of a funk, and I was like really drunk that day and or that weekend, and kind of napped a little bit on the couch while watching all these weird movies. I mean, it was a really interesting sort of eclectic B-movie sort of series of choices from Patton. And this one was important to him because he's seen it on cable a lot when he was young in the 80s. And it's a punk rock movie. It's one of the punk rock movies. And the way Penelope Spheris approached the filming was pretty in line with some of her documentary work. This is, after she had done The Decline of Western Civilization Part 1. And, definitely doesn't foreshadow anything about her future when it comes to doing Wayne's World or the Beverly Hillbillies TV program or movie adaptation of the TV program, which is another thing that was funny was trying to find Penelope Spheris interviews so I could maybe use them for my Suburbia review, my Suburbia episode that was also probably have to cover some Chili Pepper stuff because Flea is in Suburbia as well, prominently, and a couple of bands like the Vandals and TSOL, if I'm not remembering incorrectly. Problem was most of the press that came out on her that was available to search on archive.org was stuff from the 90s after she had hit it big with Wayne's World and then was doing, like there'd be a book profiling all these modern directors or something, or all these directors that were being featured in a particular sort of write-up for this, whatever was happening that year. And Penelope Spheris would be on the pictures of her on the set of the Beverly Hillbillies. So, I mean, I hope she still makes some money off of the old stuff, and I hope she made enough money off of the 90s stuff to be very comfortable in whatever she wants to do. But this is a really fun artifact that I found I'd like to read from. It's a 1982 issue of a zine, a fanzine called Flipside. And it's a punk rock magazine, and they have a little interview with her. Let's see, there's the interviewers' names are like Teresa and Grant. I'm just going to read. Oh, there's also an interviewer named Shredder. So I'm just going to read as one, interviewer instead of, giving you their names every time. And I'll read Penelope's responses. It says, Penelope Spheris is the director of the now quite old Decline of Western Civilization, who turned out to be a lively talker that gesticulates and shouts half of what she says. Besides that she's the coolest adult, senior citizen, in L.A., this interview was conducted by Shredder, Teresa, and Grant Miner. Did you see the review of Decline in Time magazine? Yeah, I thought it was real nice of them to do that. Just to review it. Yeah? What did you think of them calling it an acid test of hipness? Well, I don't care what they saw as long as they say something, because you got to look at it like this. To break the barriers between us and them is real difficult. So just that they review it or acknowledge it is cool, you know? Have you distributed it in the East? Yeah, it ate shit in New York. Why? Why? Because they're a bunch of fucking assholes. I heard it did well in SF, though. It did. Because in SF, they are a bunch of nice, intelligent people. That's why. They are normal people. What do you think about the violence in the film? I don't think it's any big deal. Do you think the media has exploited it? Yeah, but I think that... I don't know. I feel like even I wish it would be more, you know? They're kind of puttering out, aren't they? Like the Fleetwood was all about the height of things, and then it kind of went downhill. Do you think riots are healthy? Yeah, except for the people they kill. It's not too healthy for them. We're going to write a movie, Lon and I are. We're just finishing a movie about violence and advertising, you know? Like when they stop using tits and ass to sell blue jeans and life insurance, they will use violence to sell it. Like really violent commercials. Anyway, we just finished that. Now we're going to go do Invasion of the Giant Potato Bugs. Have you ever seen a potato bug? They are the ugliest insects ever. They are unbelievable. The ugliest ever. We're going to write a story about when they get to be as big as German shepherds. Great. Are you ever going to develop that into a film and release it? Well, sarcastically, since The Decline made so much money for me, I'm actually going to do it to make some bread. I made no money off The Decline. The film cost $100,000 and it's made about $150,000, but every cent of that has been put back into buying prints and advertising. I still owe two insurance salesmen $100,000, and I haven't seen anything in 2 years. Looking back, are you glad you made it? Yeah, except if anyone asks me for money for it, I'm going to kick them in the face because I don't have it. So a couple of people think I'm lying, but they're just assholes. People complain about how few bands are in the film. Well, see, I used to say I could make a movie with 5 bands. Form HB that nobody's ever heard of, you know, because there's this whole scene that is interesting enough. It doesn't matter what bands you put into it. To me, the most interesting thing is the kids, not the music. The whole, like, I don't know. It's just a repeat of Teenage Rebellion Trip, and I think it's cool, you know? So I choose bands by whoever wanted to do it, really. I shot the Gears. I didn't put the Gears in. They weren't too happy. I talked with Suburban Lawns, and it got to be a hassle with lawyers, so I didn't do it. And I talked to the Go-Go's, and I didn't do it with them, and I'm glad. The female version of the Monkees. The only real argument with punks is that the people you choose to interview are really ultra-violent and not representative of average punks. They aren't too intelligent. Well, I don't know about that. I like to think that they're extreme in a way, you know. I think the whole concept's been watered down myself. I mean, Eugene was one of the original Skinhead Army, the guy who was into it when a lot of them were on tricycles. But let them make a movie if they think that I can't do it right, little bastards. What kind of movies were you making before The Decline? I made a movie called Real Life. Before that, I made all these rock and roll movies. I had a company called Rock and Reel that I used to shoot bands like Gary Wright, the Doobie Brothers, Charlie Rich, and Emmylou Harris. I got tired of sucking on assholes at record companies. I mean, they're a bunch of jerks, and what they're doing is stupid, and I didn't want to do it anymore because it's just lightweight bullshit, you know? Publicity tapes for bands. Will there be a sequel to The Decline, or videos of bands, or... Well, X wants me to do a videotape of them, but I don't know what is going to happen with that. I don't think I would do it because I've done it so much. I'm like up to here, gestures to neck. But I would like to make a movie on heavy metal. Those people are crazy. Judas Priest and AC/DC, hell yeah, begins singing Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. Did you see where the times drew similarities between punks and HMs? There are similarities. A punk is a heavy metaler with short hair in a lot of ways because they talk the same things, like getting fucked up and insulting your girlfriend and killing your parents. You know, it's the same thing. What did you think of Darby's death? Feigning shock. Did he die? Shit, man. Why didn't anybody tell me about these things? I knew it was going to happen. No, I don't know. He dumbed out. What can I tell you? Drugs suck a big one. That's all I think. I've been trying not to be so bummed out. Let's face it. I was feeling like killing myself. Those were dark times. What brought it on? Why did I feel like that? Did you know Darby very well? Darby played How Low Can You Go games, you know? What we do is secret. Pretty weird. I don't know what brought it on. Just general. Must have been in the air. Sorry, it was an awkward sentence. But in the times you said it was inspiring? Yeah, it was. It was a bummer, but it was inspiring. I think creating something is real difficult, like taxing on a person's soul. That's why I think a lot of great artists kill themselves. Would you describe yourself as an idealist? I would describe myself as an asshole. No, I'm not an idealist. I'm a hardcore realist. As a matter of fact, the world to me looks pretty grim. I think that's why the film wasn't accepted so well in New York, because back there it is so grim. They don't want to be reminded of it. It's fucked. I must have walked over 10 dead people in the street when I was back there. Everyone is about to explode. They don't seem to express it so much back there, though. Hey, if they did, the whole city would be dead. It would be like a war zone. What do you think of the riots in England? I think it's great. I can't believe that no one's gotten killed yet. I think it's fantastic. And somehow, it's like somewhere there's a connection between what happened in 77 with the Sex Pistols and this. It just seems like they were playing around with the idea of it, anarchy in the streets. And now, here it is. How do you think of the scene now as opposed to when you made the film? Well, see, to me, when I get into it, I get into it. It's real depressing. It's really heavy, and it's a real bummer. It's true, man. I really do get into it, and I do feel fucked. And I walk around wearing black clothes, little coats when it's too hot. I feel like one of those bums. So bummed out that I feel like one of those bums. I've been standing back from it lately because I needed a break. I mean, I know that I cannot make a movie or create from any other standpoint, really. I mean, I know I have to get back into it, but right now I'm just taking a break. Man, it'd be nice to talk to her about that sort of feeling. Like, what happened in her career and her life that she finally got past that she could just go, okay, I've learned enough and done enough that I can do, you know, larger budget, silly comedy stuff. It's not going to change the world. It's not going to depress me. She probably got worn out from being so heavily involved in the sort of violence and sadness that she was putting on film in one project after another. Let's see what she says. Because when I went to New York, it really scrambled my brains. In New York, it's mean, really mean. You know why there are no punks in New York? Because they fucking get killed. That's why. There are very few punks there because the people there are like for real, heavy and mean and nasty big fuckers. And you see a punk walking along the street, dressed up, real mean looking with a swastika, or just kind of cruising down. Those guys just walk out and just knife them. They just knife them and kick them and clean their blade off and walk away. That is why there's no punks in New York. Because they are serious about it there. I'm making a film called Suburbia, which is about kids in the suburbs just destroying everything. See, you have to understand, because it's okay for you, because you're 14, 15? It's okay for you to think that there are a lot of other kids like you, and you really got a lot of energy. But for a person like my age to think that all those kids are out there, and they're just a seething pile of anger, it's fucking frightening. To most people my age, and to me sometimes. I mean, I went out and I made a movie on it, and I'll always kind of let it just be there. But it's real intimidating to the older generation. They are scared shitless of it, and I've got to go up to them and say, look, you guys, this is going on. First, they hate for me to acknowledge it, and second, they hate for me to try to perpetuate it, most of them. I think when people destroy things that they're pissed off, and I don't think there's anything wrong with being pissed off. You don't necessarily have to be pissed off to destroy things. Why else would you do it? Out of joy? Most people are angry because they don't get what they want, and these kids are obviously not getting what they want. A lot of them destroy things just to prove to each other what big, tough, mean guys they are. You mean to say there isn't any anger? No anger, maybe just packed in frustration, but they don't have to be angry to wreck things. I think a lot of them are just pushing cliche violence they see on TV. Look, what can I tell you? You kids have got a lot of complaints, and you're angry, and so am I. What else can I tell you? If you are a longtime listener of A History of Rock and Roll and Film and Rock and Roll. Do not be surprised if I pull this audio or this interview for a future episode on Suburbia, or at least parts of it. But you in the Patreon feed, you got to hear it first.
Please remember to replace the speaker on the post when you leave the theater.
Now, I was at the library recently and I saw a book on the shelf called Every Night is Saturday Night by Wanda Jackson with Scott B. Bumbar. Now, Every Night is Saturday Night, or Every Night is a Friday Night, is an often used title for books or documentaries about musicians or performers. The first one I heard of was Bobby Keys has a documentary. I think it was on Amazon Prime or elsewhere called Every Night is Saturday Night, if I'm remembering correctly. And this looks to me like a book that should have been written a long time ago in a different form. Like when Wanda had more, I don't know, more going on as far as wanting to tell her story. It feels a bit, not terribly reluctant, but it feels like it's a person towards the end of their life and remembering what they can remember. And that is to say that it's actually full of detail about a lot of inconsequential things that I don't think most readers, most rock and roll fans would really worry about. So it's only about 270, 80 pages. I didn't read the whole thing. I just kind of flipped through it, and I keep looking for interesting stuff. I can't say I recommend it unless you're just a huge Wanda. I mean, if you're a huge Wanda Jackson fan, I would assume you've already found it, read it, and know about it. But if you don't, then this is for you because it's as good as you're going to get straight from her. There is a whole chapter of her on the Nick Toshi's book, or in the Nick Toshi's book, Unsung Heroes of Rock and Roll, that we will get to in our series here. Don't know if there's a movie I should tie in to Wanda to make it a regular sort of episode in the main feed, or if I'll just sort of cover it here in the Patreon. But I figured I'd just dig into a couple of excerpts from this book so it justifies the fact that I checked it out and I took it home and it's been sitting in my living room for the last month and a half. From Chapter 8, I Wish I Was Your Friend. Daddy and I pulled into KTOC radio station parking lot in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, on a hot July afternoon in 1955. When a traveling artist was scheduled to play a show in those days, they'd make sure to arrive in town a few hours early to appear on the local airwaves. Radio stations weren't bound by a particular format then, so you had to time your arrival to coincide with when the country programming was on the air. The idea was to have a DJ play your record, ask you a few questions, and give you a chance to invite the listeners to that night's show. There was another reason why those radio appearances were so important. It's no secret that many of the legends of country music used to like to have a good time. And often, that good time was accompanied by a few drinks. As a result, some of them, Hank Williams was one of the first, earned a reputation for being, shall we say, less than 100% dependable when it came to showing up for a scheduled performance. Heck, George Jones even came to be known as No-Show Jones back in his young and wilder days. So going on the radio not only gave us artists a chance to promote our live shows, it also gave advance ticket holders the assurance that we had indeed arrived in town and would be appearing that night as advertised. My show in Cape Girardeau was to be a package show, meaning several artists were on the bill. One of them was a young singer who was rapidly gaining a strong regional following throughout the South. I had been told that he would also be joining me for the interview. As you know from my response to duetting with Billy Gray, I was always kind of enjoyed having the spotlight to myself, but this guy was headlining the show, so even though I'd never heard of him or his records, I decided not to let it bother me. Daddy and I arrived at KTOC first. We headed inside and were greeted by a friendly young woman at the front. Okay, see what I mean? Like this is a lot of padding, but if you weren't so far on in years and might not be with us that much longer, I don't think anyone, Wanda, would really want to include this in the book. But it kind of makes me sad because it makes me feel like, oh, I'm listening to someone who has a lot of details they remember about their life in these stories, and it's important to them to get it all out there, even though they can't just cut to the chase, get to the good stuff. Because I'll feel bad if I criticize this and say, hurry up, get to the next part. She talks about meeting Elvis Presley. Thought he was cute. He flashed a shy smile. Hi there, he kind of half mumbled. I'm Elvis Presley. He moved toward me with his hand extended. I wish I could say the heavens opened and I heard angels singing, but it wasn't anything quite that dramatic. Still, I have to admit, it did seem as if a presence had entered the room. Of course, I recognized right away that Elvis was handsome, but I was actually a little taken aback by his outfit. He was wearing black slacks and a black shirt and a yellow sport coat. I'd never seen a yellow sport coat in my life. I mean, just wait until the 80s and she sees Wide World of Sports. Good heavens. In 1955, that just wasn't what the kind of clothing a typical man would wear. But I guess he wasn't a typical man. He also had curly hair that day, which I later found out was because he'd gotten a perm. I thought that was pretty funny. But there was no question that this guy was magnetic. There's a lot of details about not much happening. Her dad comes up next to her and introduces himself to Elvis. Elvis is very polite. She talks about how over the years she's been asked about Elvis Presley more than any topic. And she's been a bit resentful in the past about like, hey, I've done a lot of things. Why aren't you asking me about those? Why are you asking me again about Elvis? Eventually, she comes to embrace that sort of history she had with him and the memories she had with him. It was Elvis who believed that I could sing rock and roll before I believed it myself. It was Elvis who took the time to help me understand the new musical revolution that was exploding all around us. And it was Elvis who, for a short time in the mid-1950s, won my heart as I was just beginning to understand what it meant to fully embrace my femininity and express myself as a young woman. Today, I very much enjoy talking about Elvis and reflecting on the warm memories that had such an influence on my life and career. Later on, a few more pages down the line, she talks about, hitting the road with her dad to play a lot of these out-of-town shows after she graduated. Like, she's 17 years old when she's meeting Elvis for the first time, and she has just graduated from high school. After a long day of driving, we stopped for the night in Pocahontas, Arkansas to get some rest. The next morning, Daddy was up early. He slipped out of the room to grab a newspaper and come back with a cup of coffee from the diner next door. I like to stay up late at night, so I've never been a morning person. I was already on rock and roll time before I ever knew there was such a thing as rock and roll. We better get on the road pretty soon, Wanda, Daddy said quietly. I pulled the covers over my head and groaned. Here, I got this for you, he chuckled as he set a coffee cup on the nightstand. You're going to have to develop a taste for it if this is the life you've chosen. Now come on and let's get moving. It probably sounds old-fashioned now, but in those days, there was just no such thing as rolling out of bed, throwing on sweatpants and flip-flops, and shuffling into the car half asleep. Daddy certainly never would have allowed it, and I wouldn't have allowed it for myself either. Presentation was, and still is, very important to me, both on and off stage. I really do believe that a lady should always look her best. I see some of these gals go on stage today wearing an old pair of jeans and a t-shirt, and I just can't help but wonder if they're getting ready to entertain an audience or if they forgot to change clothes when they got done cutting the grass. I guess things are just different now than they used to be, but I still kind of like the old way of doing things. Case in point, Daddy headed out to the car to read the paper while I got ready. I applied a fresh coat of fingernail polish, put on my makeup, and slipped on a 3/4 length yellow skirt I'd laid out the night before. I had a cute matching yellow short-sleeve blouse, which I accented with a black rose pin. I strapped on my heel. See, if this is the kind of thing that gets you fired up, that this book has it for you. Details like that. So there we go. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to cover before bailing on this. There's further on, chapter 12, she talks about a month-long tour in 57 with Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis, and Oni Wheeler, who was recording for Columbia Records at that time. I mean, things like that. All right. Important to be... Oni Wheeler was recording for Columbia Records at the time? Holy smokes. So they started in Billings, Montana, and started working their way down south to the Big D Jamboree in Dallas. Forget about the stage. The real show was going on after hours with Johnny and Jerry Lee. Those guys would tear up hotel rooms like you wouldn't believe. Jerry Lee, in particular, was a wild man. If you didn't watch him, he'd rip up everything in sight. I remember one time we got to a job in the early afternoon. Jerry Lee always went in early to check out the piano. He'd get so mad if it hadn't been tuned or if a key was stuck or something. We didn't have writers in our contracts then, so you had to wait until you got to a gig to find out if they'd supplied everything you needed. I was there listening to him try out this one particular piano, and boy, was he mad. It was an old upright that had seen better days. He said, "Who would bring a piano like this and expect me to play it? I'll tear this thing up before my show's over so nobody else will have to use it. I'm going to put it out of its misery." And he did too, boy. He kicked the bottom of it in, put his feet up on those keys, and busted as many of them as he could. He kind of frightened me. I didn't want to be around Jerry Lee too much. Somewhere along the way on that tour, we did a Sunday matinee and didn't have an evening show. I had seen a little church close by where we were staying. I told Daddy I'd like to go to church that evening, but he wasn't interested. I said, "I'll ask if anybody wants to go." I'm sure he probably laughed to himself at that since those boys weren't exactly big churchgoers at that time. "Okay, but hold on a minute," he said. "Let me go let them know you have something to ask them." Different time, folks. If that wasn't already abundantly clear. He went back where all the guys were hanging out and drinking and doing whatever else those boys were doing that Daddy did his best to shield me from. He cleared the way and made sure everyone was dressed. "Fellas, one wants to ask y'all something," he said. I went into a dressing room where they were all hanging out. I said, "I'm going to go to church tonight. Who would like to go with me?" Dead silence. I said, "Well, okay, I just wanted to let you all know in case anyone wanted to come along." Everybody looked at the floor. I turned to go. As I was walking away, I heard a voice behind me. "Hold it, Wanda, hold it." I turned around. Jerry Lee was getting up from his chair. "I'd like to go to church with you," he smiled. I didn't know what to say as we walked down the road to that little church. I was kind of hoping maybe several of the boys would have come along. The prospect of being alone with Jerry Lee was pretty scary to me. But once we started talking, he was a perfect gentleman. We slipped into the service a little late and sat in the back. We shared a hymn book and sang those great old songs together that have been a part of both our formative years. It was really sweet, and that memory is very dear to me. Of all the people, it was Jerry Lee who went to church with me. We've since become good friends, and I always enjoy seeing him. We're about the only two left from that group. And then she goes on to talk about a show she did in England with him many years later, sort of, I think, within the last decade or so. And, she only had a small dressing room for herself, but he had a bigger one, but he had to go up some stairs to get to it. And so he basically kind of, knocked on the door and said, "Hey, how about if I change in your room if you would let me? Because damn it, I'm not going up those stairs anymore." And she sort of enjoys the comedy of, the young man that used to kick the shit out of pianos all by himself, now having a tough time with his legs, getting up a flight of stairs. So she had a really bad situation back in 1955 at the Grand Ole Opry. She felt like she was being made fun of by the crew there on stage with her. There were members of the Opry performing troupe that were sitting on bales of hay behind her while she came out to sing for the first time on the Ryman Auditorium stage, and like they were doing little physical comedy, behind her. She didn't take to that very well, being, a young up-and-coming singer. And that's the thing about the Opry. They're the country music establishment, so there's always stories about the greatest heroes of country music getting shit on by people at that place. I mean, it's at any wonder that Johnny Cash kicked out all the footlights when he played there. Oh my gosh. I've got a Johnny Cash movie, by the way, picked out for an episode about him. I read his autobiography while I was on tour in a van, in a 3-piece band many years ago. Helped keep me sane during some weird times. And I would be a coward and a liar if I didn't admit to you that I read that book not just because I liked Johnny Cash. That was one thing, but I read the book mostly because I watched the movie High Fidelity twice, and it really stuck out to me that the main character talks about being fairly well read when it comes to the classics of literature and such. But still, I'll have to say that my all-time favorite book is Cash. What was it? Cash: The Story of Johnny Cash by Johnny Cash. Cash: The Autobiography of Johnny Cash by Johnny Cash. I think that's what he says, and I was like, you know what? This wasn't written by a normal Hollywood script guy. This was a book originally. This was written by a writer. So I think that makes it worth my time. And I was right. So point being, I know a thing or two about Johnny Cash's life. And I've also bookmarked a couple of other accounts from other authors that are available on archive.org for now, until we see what the outcome of this lawsuit is. Because I think it's important to not just take the artist's word for it. Not because they won't be honest. They'll be honest from their point of view, but they have their own visions of what's important to relate to their audience and what their audience wants to hear. And it's other people documenting things and interviewing other folks that knew those artists that I think provide the other side and the bigger picture that's necessary. Or maybe a very, very smaller picture, a lot of smaller pictures, the things that the person who lived that life wouldn't think were relevant or important or not important to them, or they just forgot about them, Where was I? Wanda. Yeah. So, as many of us know, in around 2011, there was this whole thing between her and Jack White. Now, she says this is when she returned to the Opry stage for the first time in 56 years. When she played there in the 50s, she wore this specific, she specifically worked out this whole outfit with her mother, this white blouse with her shoulders showing, and Ernest Tubb scolded her backstage, like, where are the clothes you're going to wear on stage? And she's like, I'm going to wear this. And he's like, you are not, missy, So she was made to feel like shit before she even got out there. They had to rush around and figure out some kind of compromise. You know what? Why don't I just flip back to the earlier part of the book and just read what she says? What am I doing? We've got all day. And this is rock and roll and country music history here. So she's backstage with her guitar, and Ernest Tubb comes from, the side stage towards her and says, "Are you Wanda Jackson?" "Yes, sir." "Okay, honey, you're next on the show. I'll introduce you, so go ahead and get ready." "Thank you, Mr. Tubb. I am ready." He looked kind of startled, and his big smile melted away. "Oh, no, my goodness, honey," he stammered. "You can't go out on stage of the Grand Ole Opry like that." I could feel my ears getting hot. "Like what?" I asked. He took a step back. "You can't go out there with your shoulders showing like that." I could not believe it. Here I was in the dress that Mother and I had spent so much time designing. I had on those boots, and I looked so cute with my big guitar on. I said, "Well, this is the only thing I brought. I wore it to the show." "I don't know what to tell you," he said. "You're going to have to cover up or you can't go on." She points out that it was, still March, and it was cool out in Nashville, so she did arrive with a white jacket, like an imitation leather jacket with fringe. And she ran back to the dressing room, grabbed it, put it on over her dress, then put the guitar over that as Ernest Tubb introduced her to the audience, and went out on the stage feeling like a little kid who'd just been reprimanded, and feeling pretty heartbroken that she had to cover up this cute dress that she loved, that her mom had helped her make or worked on with her. And I think that was the thing that she did. They started out, they bought an outfit or two, and her mom was like, "We can't afford to just keep buying stage outfits when I can just help you make them." Which is kind of cool. If you're into that, if you're into those kind of things, yeah, there's elements of her story there. It's a lot of, very girly sort of, stuff that I'm not going to relate to, and a lot of mom and dad said this, and I felt this way. I mean, good for her for having all this detail to recollect in, her advancing years. But, she goes on up to the microphone and plays her first song called I Cried Again by Audrey Inman. And she was pretty surprised by the sound of like the Opry band coming in to play with her, and because she didn't get to rehearse with them. And she had been used to playing with this group called Hank's Brazos Valley Boys. Apparently they were the #1 Western swing band in the nation, she says, with drums, horns, 2 fiddles, electric guitar, piano, upright bass, and then steel guitar players. So when she goes out on the Ryman stage, she's a little bit unnerved by just like bass, guitar, fiddle, and maybe, some piano being available for the performers. After she kind of gets over that initial discomfort, she settles in as best she can, but she finds out that something's going on stage that she didn't reckon with, because she doesn't really track the crowd reaction being like genuinely about her anyway. And she says, halfway through her song, they were craning their necks to see around me. During an instrumental section, I turned and saw 2 of the show's comedians, Minnie Pearl and String Bean, were cutting up, laughing, and doing all kinds of silly stuff behind me. They were kind of egging on the other cast members by kidding around during my song. I'm sure it was all intended as good fun, but I couldn't keep the attention of the audience. How could I, with those 2 carrying on behind me? I mean, they were funny, so that made it pretty hard to compete. That's a very diplomatic way to put things. That's a very polite person, just in the fullness of time, deciding to state the facts as she saw them and say, well, maybe they were just, doing what they normally did. They want to entertain the audience. How could I argue? I wasn't anybody. What a nice person. Anyhow, the return to the Opry in 2011, she has a very funny a little way of explaining her choices for wardrobe. She said, I even wore a fringed white blouse with long sleeves, so the ghost of Ernest Tubb wouldn't have to worry about seeing my shoulders. It's not that I learned my lesson. It's just that old age got me. I always say that necklines go up when you're a little girl, come down when you're a teenager, and go right back up if you become a gospel singer. Now I can wear whatever I want, but you have to ask yourself what looks best for where you are in life. The man who coaxed me back to the Opry stage was singer, guitarist, and producer Jack White. I just finished recording my 40th studio album, The Party Ain't Over, with Jack, and he suggested we go to the Opry with the band he put together for the tour. It was actually the first time he and I performed together publicly, and I'll never forget what a great evening it was. She talks about how in the 2000s she had a manager that was much younger, a gentleman that died at the age of 31 in 2015, a publicist manager named John Hensley, who had made sure that she had a lot more visibility among a younger crowd than she had in a long time. And I can say from my own experience here in Seattle, I remember the local paper covering when she was on her way to play a Seattle show and interviewing her. I thought that was really cool. I mean, I knew her just from like a rock and roll documentary series. That was about it. But I remember her saying like, oh, when I was young, I didn't really, I do whatever I want on stage. But now that I have so many young ladies looking up to me as this, elder stateswoman, I'm paraphrasing what I can remember, like this elder stateswoman status, I would never appear with a beer in my hand on stage. That's just not, the right thing to do. Also, Jesus and the Lord wouldn't want that, et cetera, et cetera. I thought, that's it. I mean, I never would have thought about it that way. I mean, she's a rock and roller. She can do whatever she wants, but it's interesting to think about how much those decisions kind of weigh upon her, at this stage of her career. But that's the kind of thing that I'm sure I would, even if I was her age, I was like, yeah, I'm playing in a bar, or I'm playing at a venue of a club, or even if it's a small theater or whatever, it's an alcohol serving establishment. I don't know. Maybe I wouldn't want a little kid to see me drinking alcohol on stage going, oh, I'm having a great time. Everyone should do this. But the teenagers and adults, I wouldn't imagine that a lot of these artists are going to have a huge sway over them, when they're in their like 70s. There's other factors at play when it comes to convincing you to drink alcohol as a young person, I'm saying. But she talks about, her manager, John, telling Wendell, who I think is her husband, that Jack White was interested in recording her. Wendell didn't know anything about Jack at the time, so he didn't pay much attention. We were at home one day when he said, "Boy, I keep getting all these emails from this Jack White guy. He must really want to work with you." My daughter Gina was walking through the room and overheard this comment. She stopped right in her tracks. "What did you say, Dad? Jack White is a huge star. You need to write him back immediately." Once the grandkids found out about this, they went nuts. My granddaughter said, "Ma, you don't know Jack White? He's the biggest thing in the world. You've got to work with him." At first, I wasn't really sure if I wanted to do it or not. Honestly, I was a little intimidated. Jack was a big rock star, and he seemed to come from a different world than me. I just had to pause. Have a giggle. Forgive your narrator. I'm easily moved by stories like this. Multi-generational appreciation of music and performers always gets to me. I didn't know if we would be completely compatible or if he would really understand me as an artist. But for the sake of my children and grandchildren, I reluctantly resigned myself to giving it a try. Jack and I began communicating about song ideas over the phone and via email, but I never actually saw him in person until it was time to record. I went down to Nashville in 2010 and met up with him at his house. He had a beautiful home and about 5 acres. He showed me around, and I thought he was so cute with that hair hanging down in his face. I never did mind long hair on guys if it was clean and neat. There was a shyness about Jack that kind of reminded me of Elvis. Which is funny because he plays Elvis in the movie Walk Hard. That's karate, man. Only 2 kinds of people know that. Only two kinds of people know how to do that stuff. The Chinese and me. I'm probably misquoting that, but it's been, 10, 15 years. I liked him right away. But there was still a bit of awkwardness between us because we were virtually strangers. Now, there's more to that story. It gets very cute and very charming, and I will save it for another time. Now that we've done some Wanda Jacksoning, let's move on to some Beatlesing. I found a book called 150 Glimpses of the Beatles, which is really interesting in places. I think for a Beatles scholar, it might be a fun book to have, to keep around. Maybe bust out at parties or leave on the coffee table for people to flip through if you have a lot of friends that are into music. I'll just read, for an example, read chapter 79. Or glimpse number 79, I suppose it is. A short, blurry, black and white news clip shows the Beatles climbing the steps of an aeroplane through an arch, emblazoned with the message, BOAC welcomes the Beatles. 2 oddities date it to 7 June 1964. First, the Beatle at the back is taller than Ringo, but he is definitely not George, who is 3 steps up, or John, 2 steps up, or Paul, who is alongside him. When this unidentified Beatle turns around to wave to the crowds, it turns out to be our poor old friend Jimmy Nicol, who stood in for Ringo when Ringo went down with tonsillitis. But there's also another person walking up those steps with the group, a matronly figure in an old-fashioned hat, like a figure out of a Giles cartoon. Though I don't get that one. You're going to have to help me with that one, folks. Or the internet will. I'm sure the internet will help me. It's too early in the day for me to stop recording now and go look it up. For a split second, she half turns, beaming. It is Aunt Mimi, who had been invited by John to join them on their flight to Antipodes. I assume that's the pronunciation and it's not Antipodes. Where she had relations. With whom? Who is she having relations? Oh, that's not what they mean. George judged this trip his favorite. I remember them saying, "Return to your seats because we're approaching Hong Kong," and I thought, we can't be there already. We'd been sitting on the floor drinking and taking preludins for about 30 hours, and so it seemed like a 10-minute flight. Aunt Mimi would have known nothing of this particular variety of in-flight entertainment. Had she got wind of it, she would not have been amused, but John was clearly on his best behavior. Interviewed during the flight by an Australian journalist called Bob Rogers, he's a little sleepy and tongue-tied, but unusually polite. John, have you ever been interviewed 34,000 feet above sea level before? No, definitely not. How are you enjoying the trip? Not bad. It's a bit long, you know, but they're looking after us well. Is this the longest trip you've made? I don't know. He scrunches up his eyes as if trying to work it out. Yes, it is, isn't it? Hard-hitting journalism. Oh, they really just wanted every piece of the Beatles they could get, didn't they? Just anything. Any little tiny thing. In a voiceover, Roger says, John Lennon's famous Aunt Mimi, who brought him up in Liverpool, was also on board. It was Lennon's way of saying thank you. Aunt Mimi is much more outgoing than John. She has made an effort with a string of pearls around her neck and an elaborate hat consisting of lots of flowers bunched together. She's a good-looking woman with high cheekbones, and despite her sourpuss reputation, merry almost to the point of bubbliness. Rogers introduces her, Mrs. Mary Elizabeth Smith of Woolton, just outside of Liverpool, better known as Aunt Mimi, the lady who brought John Lennon up from a boy. Yes, that's right, she looks very proud. What sort of a boy was he? A lovable rebel, she laughs out loud and grins. A lovable rebel. Did he get into trouble? Not real trouble, just mischievous, you know. Did you think he was going to become a star such as this in the music world when he was a boy? Yes. No, I thought he was going to become prime minister. I thought he was going to unite us all in a one world government. I thought he was going to be the most famous person ever. Good heavens. No, not in music, not the music world at all, but I always felt he would do something with his writing and drawing. The only other filmed interview with Aunt Mimi was to take place 17 years later, in 1981, a year after John's death. Ah, damn. Southern TV's James Montgomery conducted it at Mimi's seaside house, Harbor's Edge, which John bought for her in 1965. Note about James Montgomery, he was later to marry a model, actress, and men-only columnist Fiona Richmond, star of, among others, Let's Get Laid, 1977, From Here to Virginity, 1981, and Telltale Tits, 1987. Damn! Good on you, James Montgomery. Now, for the first time, his Aunt Mimi Smith has opened the door of her home in Dorset to talk of an extraordinary friendship that existed between them and lasted until his death just a year ago. John Lennon bought this house, which looks over Sandbanks Bay, for his Aunt Mimi 16 years ago. Montgomery and Aunt Mimi are seen sorting through old snapshots of the young John. Mimi is wearing a smart black suit with a white silk shirt and a silver brooch. Now, age 75, she remembers buying John his first guitar. Well, I battled against it for quite a long time. I didn't want him wasting his college time and missing lectures by wasting his time playing the guitar. Exasperation creeps into her voice, as though in some parallel universe, her feckless nephew is still nagging her for his first guitar, and she is still trying to steer him onto the straight and narrow. Whereas his training would be last. These things come and go. They're playing guitar one week, everyone's clamoring for them, and then they disappear, and nobody ever hears of them again. And then what was I going to do if I had a boy of 21 thrown back on my hands, qualified for nothing? Her voice rises and trembles on the word nothing. Montgomery asks Aunt Mimi if she can remember when John got his first guitar. He was a bit like yourself, a soft soaper. A flash of her nephew's combative flintiness. And he picks me up, you know. Here she performs kissing gestures and noises, kisses me on the cheek. Mimi, can I have a guitar? And he hadn't any money to get a guitar. There was only me who could buy him one. And I remember we went to Liverpool and we went into a guitar shop and they were all over the place and I didn't know anything about them, so he chose one and it was £17. How surprised were you that the Beatles went on to achieve worldwide fame and success? I knew they had something, but nobody expected this. It was a shock to them too. She talks of the days when John would come to visit her at her new house by the seaside. He'd nip down weekends. Suddenly there'd be a whirlwind and he'd come in. It was usually when the pressure was getting a bit much and he'd come down here and do cartwheels on the beach, she laughs and smiles. By himself, nobody else there. After he'd gone to live in America, they would talk on the telephone once or twice a week. About current affairs, how the pound was going up and down, that sort of thing. Another time, he'd been reminiscing about his childhood. The funny things, I was always chasing him, you know. She gives a throaty chuckle. I knew what he was up to before, she pauses, clearly visualizing young John. What he could not make out was how I knew when he was up to something, she carries on laughing, obviously enjoying the memory. What about the antics he got up to, the famous love-in with Yoko Ono? Did you talk to him about that? I certainly did. I just found him, telephoned him, and said, "That's enough, thank you, we've had enough. Keep that lot for the music hall," she giggles. And that was the end of it. So he listened to you then. Well, though he rebelled and said, "I'm not going to do as you tell me," he always did. When he'd been naughty, I'd ring him up and I'd say, "Don't have me come to New York." And he'd say, "You're just being grumpy." So as soon as he said that, down goes the phone, you see. And then I'd wait for about half an hour and he'd get friendly with me again. She puts on John's voice. "Hello, is that you, Gertie? Never mind, Gertie," she roars with laughter. "Did he give you many presents?" Honestly, the place is full of presents, beads, pearls, everything. I could have had anything in the world, but I'm just one of those people who's rather Spartan, and I don't want anything. The camera focuses on John's framed silver heart from the Variety Club of Great Britain sitting on the mantelpiece, presented to him by Harold Wilson in 1964. What do you think of all these stories that have been published about him since his death? Stories about his private life, his sex life? Jesus, dude. I've never heard anything like it in my life. I think they're sick, depraved people obsessed with sex, craving for attention. When was the last time he phoned you? The night before he was murdered, 2 hours. And he would say, "I'll be seeing you soon, Mimi. I can't wait to see you." And then, of course, at 5 o'clock the next morning, it came over the overseas news. And honestly, if I thought he was dead, I don't think I could go on. I don't think of him as dead. Leaving that where it is, the interviewer moves on, not wishing to explore the meaning of that any further for some reason. Of all the songs John played and sang, was there a favorite one that you enjoyed? Well, I don't know. I think A Hard Day's Night is not so bad at the present time. Once again, she laughs her throaty laugh. Now, another really interesting book that I found on my local library shelf, at the same time as I found the Glimpses of the Beatles book. Hope you enjoyed the sound of a very feisty motorcyclist outside my window. I wish I had stopped talking, actually, so you could have heard it better. This book is called Listen Up, because there's an exclamation point after the word up, by Mark Howard, with Chris Howard. And the subtitle is Recording Music with Bob Dylan, Neil Young, U2, REM, The Tragically Hip, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Tom Waits, by Mark Howard, Grammy awarding. Hey, everybody. Grammy awarding producer. Winning. Now, chapter 25 is Tom Waits. And he says that in January 2002, Andy Culkin, the head of Anti Records, called me. He was a big fan of the Lucinda Williams album that, had been produced by the author. And he'd pitched my name to Tom Waits for his next record. And I was thrilled. I was a big fan of Tom's Bone Machine album. Andy wasn't sure when Tom wanted to start, but said that Tom would call me. A year passed, and I assumed they must have recorded with someone else. Then, hopefully you heard that in the background. Meow. Someone's trying to catch up to somebody else. In February 2003, Tom finally called. "Hey, Mark," he said in his low, gravelly voice. "I was wondering if you would be available to make my next record." I agreed right away. I understand you produce a lot of records, he continued. I have the producing part covered by my wife, Kathleen, and me. Would it be possible for you to separate the production and the engineering part, then record and mix my record? I told him I actually did that a lot. I also told him where I was working, at the Paramore, and that we could record there if he liked. Tom said that although it sounded great, he liked to work close to home, so he was with family. The studio that was closest to his home was more than 2 hours away, and it would be a battle going back and forth every day. I suggested I do a studio installation somewhere nearer. Well, that would be interesting, he said. He told me about an old schoolhouse that people rented for events. I flew to Oakland, rented a car, and drove up to a little town called Valley Ford, just north of San Francisco. It was about a 20-minute drive past Petaluma, a short drive past Bodega Bay, where Alfred Hitchcock had filmed his 1963 horror film, The Birds. Note to myself, I should check out Alfred Hitchcock. Sorry, I'm going to write this down. The Birds. Okay, I'll save that for later. What a creepy little fishing village Bodega Bay was. Driving in, I felt a chill in the air. It was windy and disturbing because the birds really do swarm there. Tom was to meet me there at 2 p.m. There was just a little general store with a wooden porch, and I imagined Tom showing up in a rusted-out 50s pickup. Cars came and went, but not Tom. I was sitting on the wooden bench in front of the general store when a woman driving a black Audi with tinted windows pulled up. The car sat there for a good 15 minutes before the woman got out and walked over to the store. Just as she entered the building, she looked over at me and asked, "You're not Mark, are you?" I told her I was, but she continued into the store, which I thought was strange. When she came back out, she said, "Tom said he wanted to talk to you." I explained that I had been waiting for him for an hour, but he hadn't shown up. She told me to come over to the car, so I walked over with her. She opened the back door, and there he was. I hadn't been able to see him because of the blackened windows. Tom Waits climbed out, dressed entirely in denim, what we call in Canada the Canadian tuxedo. "Hey, Mark, it's me, Tom. Sorry I'm late. I was working on a preparation." I didn't know what that meant, but I told him it was fine. We drove around the corner to the schoolhouse, a long wooden building with steps that led up to a set of double doors. There was a big old barn beside it and a big dirt parking lot in front. We walked in, and the schoolhouse was still intact, complete with chalkboards and alphabet cards hanging above them. It was just one big classroom with girls' and boys' bathrooms, with the wooden flooring and fluorescent lighting. It was all a bit stark, although it did have windows along the front and the possibility of good natural light. I brought a few pieces of test gear, like always, a voltage meter and a little cassette blaster that I hooked up to an acoustic guitar pickup to check the magnetic field. The voltage was 220 and the magnetic field was perfect. Sorry, near perfect. Tom asked if I thought it would work, and I said I did. It was exactly the same size as the grand ballroom at the Paramount. He said he'd talk to the custodian and see if he could rent it for a couple of months. So, if the terminology of the acoustic guitar pickup and the cassette blaster is sort of off-putting or not clear for you, I think what he's saying is he's wired up an acoustic guitar pickup, which is like an electric guitar pickup, basically a sealed sort of it's like a rectangular, like imagine a Sucret's box or an Altoids box, like a little tin that you would put mints in, right? But it's sealed with wax, and inside of it there is some magnets of a certain voltage, a desired voltage, or I guess not voltage, it was an output, I would say, or resistance. I don't know. Magnets, people. Jesus, leave me alone. but with copper wire wrapped around it. Either a couple of bars, like rectangular little magnets, or pole pieces, individual 6 magnets with copper wire wrapped around them in coils. And when you place that underneath guitar strings, steel guitar strings, the vibration of the guitar strings disrupts the magnetic field, and then that signal goes through some wires and then into an amplifier powered by transistors or tubes or both, and a transformer as well, and then pushed into speakers. That's how electric guitar stuff works. Now, in this case, he's like walking around an empty schoolhouse like he's holding a PKE meter in Ghostbusters. And he's basically just like wired it up, I assume, to a little cassette tape player with some speakers on it, right? Like turned up. So that, as anyone that plays electric guitar knows, when you get the front part of your guitar close to something that's putting out a lot of signal, like, you know, your cable router or anything transmitting radio waves or other kinds of electric or electronic equipment, anything that's chuffing, you know, energetically and cranking out electrons or protons or whatever the dickens it is, or microwaves, you get noise and interference in your amplifier, you know, through your guitar. So that's probably a good cheap way for him to just sort of like wave this thing around like you would like you know, kind of like a stud finder trying to find the parts in the wall, you know, that you want to like hammer some or drill some stuff into. You know, it's like if you hold this acoustic guitar pickup to the right source or the right part of the room and you hear and that happens way too often, you know it's not a good room to record in. I hope you all enjoyed that incredibly scientific explanation of something that you will never, ever, ever, ever do, and neither will I. Anyhow, back to Tom. He wants to play some songs for the producer that he'd been working on, but had no way to play them because they were on a Tascam 4-track cassette machine, which is a small cassette recorder unit, but you can't take a tape that you've recorded that stuff on and put it in a normal tape player. I suggested he come to LA for a day so we could listen to the songs, and I told him that I would be able to mix them down so he could listen to them on a CD in his car. He was enthusiastic. Wow, that's what I need. Tom and his wife, Kathleen Brennan, came to LA to work with me at the Paramore on March 2003. This is the Patreon, folks. You're getting the unedited version of my deliverance. You lucky people. I walked them around the property, and they couldn't believe how beautiful it was. Tom pulled out his 4-track cassette recorder, and I plugged it in. The songs were recordings he had done in the bathroom of his house, late at night while everyone was sleeping. They sounded so animalistic. He had grunted into the mic, and although it was distorted, the recording featured a nice overdrive. And the difference there for the non-home recorder or the non-guitarist is that there's digital distortion that comes from, you know, overloading the sort of input signal on a piece of machinery that can't handle it, that can be pleasant in some ways, or depending on the machine itself, very abrasive and hard to listen to. The magic in-between point is probably what he's talking about, where somehow the mic he was shouting into and the tape deck was creating an not like this sort of a clean sound, but like this kind of sound. You know, something that's a little more grungy sounding, but not so distorted like someone's screaming through a Texas Instruments calculator at you. More like they're screaming through an old tape machine at you. You know? I mean, Mark Howard, please, if you're hearing this, hire me, for crying out loud. I know so much about sound, obviously. But it goes back to the discussions about the Nine Inch Nails recording sessions in previous episodes of a history of rock and roll and film and rock and roll when I was talking about The Crow and the recording of Pretty Hate Machine and the recording of, The Downward Spiral, how Trent Reznor would master this art of creating distortion in signals that he had recorded very cleanly and then manipulate them after the fact to make the distortion very unnerving, not a normal guitar kind of distortion, but also not so awful as just like somebody plugging a guitar into a distortion heavy metal pedal and then hitting record on their tape machine. It's an art. And apparently Tom's little experiments in the bathroom had yielded a very artsy, organic sounding grit, not a super digital kind of distortion that would really, really get ice picky in your ears. I know that after the United States, the largest amount of downloads I get for the main feed are from the country of India, and I apologize to anyone in India who is listening on the Patreon in the hopes of maybe learning how to speak English better. Now, besides the cool overdrive on the cassette recorder in the bathroom that Tom Waits was using, he's also got some really cool percussion sounds, which shouldn't be a surprise. It sounds like he had done beats with his mouth and then overdubbed pots and pans on top of them. It was so bizarre, but it was also great. When we make the record, we will re-record it to get a bigger sound, I said. I mixed it all down so that he had a reference, but they were mainly ideas for rhythm tracks with no lyrics. Tom had worked out a deal to work at the schoolhouse, and we planned to start in April. He only wanted to work weekdays. I packed up all the studio gear and all the rugs and couches and loaded them into a 24-foot U-Haul. I also took a Harley with me, a little 883 Sportster, so I would have a way to get around. The truck was also packed to the gills with a Sportster stuffed in back, so the door just closed. I left the Paramore at 5 a.m. and beat traffic. It took a lot longer to get to Valley Ford because the truck could only go 55 miles per hour and because going through the Grapevine, oh God, God help you if you've got a bad radiator going over the Grapevine. A 40-mile stretch of the Golden State Freeway was incredibly slow. There's a gradual climb to the road, and it's famous for causing cars to overheat or blow head gaskets. I arrived early in the evening, and Tom and his kids were there to help me unload the truck. I backed it up to the front entrance of the schoolhouse and pulled out the ramp. It only took an hour to unload everything. Tom said we should start bringing over some of his instruments the next day. Tom and Kathleen booked me into a bed and breakfast just up the street, a musty old Victorian house. My room felt like it belonged in a dollhouse with lots of frilly curtains and old wooden wardrobes. No TV, no internet, and the bathroom was up the hall. He was exhausted from the drive, crashed right away, blah, 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 but he had to wake up at 4 o'clock the next morning and begin wide awake with nothing to do, going to the schoolhouse to start wait a minute. Being wide awake with nothing to do, headed over to the schoolhouse to start the installation. Well, it's not nothing to do. You have a whole studio to set up, buckaroo. So he brings a tent, a Moroccan tent. I want a Moroccan tent to record in. And he sets it up over the control room and hangs the walls of the tent over the front window so no one could see inside. It was purple silk. Combined with the rugs, it felt like being in a Moroccan palace. So by 9 a.m., he's got the whole thing all set up, and he goes back to his little bed and breakfast to have some food. And then Tom shows up at the schoolhouse at noon. Wow! I would have never imagined it to be this cool, he exclaimed from the doorway. He called Kathleen and told her she needed to come over so we could show her. Later on, Tom said we needed to go to his house and pick up his gear while we had the big truck. There were green rolling hills where he lived. It felt a little like being in Ireland. We arrived at a little treed area and then carried on down a winding road to a sea of gates. They were like metal sculptures with gardening tools welded to them, old shovels, garden scissors, and a pitchfork. Once the gates opened, we drove down the lane to the house, which looked like a modern barn that had been converted into a house. There was a swimming pool that looked like a lagoon and a trampoline with cargo netting around it. The outside area was like an army training camp with ropes hanging from trees, more cargo netting for climbing, and old tire tubes stacked to climb through. It was definitely a kid's paradise. We went into Tom's storage locker, which was bigger than a garage and looked like a half-finished studio. It was packed to the ceiling with all kinds of exotic instruments, old pianos, a steam calliope, a wooden marimba, kalimbas, and a double-key Chamberlain. I was floored by the incredible things he had, and on the walls were black and white photos of him with Keith Richards. Tom said that Keith and James Brown were his heroes. That laughter is just pure joy from your narrator at the mention of those names. We loaded the truck with all kinds of musical toys and went back to the schoolhouse to unload. Now, Tom had assembled musicians to come in and record with him, including Brian Mantia, the drummer from Primus, whose real name had been misspelled at some point in his career, so he was now known as Brain. So Brain had done albums with Primus, like, the Brown album, and I think everything that Primus did up until Tim Herb Alexander came back around the time of Green Naugahyde, I want to say. But also he had done Les Claypool's Bucket of Bernie Brains, which was Brain, Les, Buckethead, Bernie Worrell, and probably some other stuff. I don't know if he played in the Frog Brigade with Les or not, but he was definitely the kind of go-to drummer for the Primus sphere of musicians in the time where Tim Alexander was sort of absent before they came back and did their the tours that I saw where they were doing Frizzle Fry in its entirety and then Sailing the Seas of Cheese in its entirety. Brain definitely has more of a John Bonham sound and style on drums as opposed to Tim Alexander's more Neil Peart style and sound on drums. In my opinion, nation, as a non-drummer. But, Tim Alexander, Rototoms. Brain, not Rototoms. At least in my experience when I saw them play. So, Mark Howard mentions that Brain brought in a Kai MPC sampler. He'd had someone do a custom paint job on. It was on the same level as the paint jobs that the Chicano lowrider cars that bounce up and down would have. Larry Taylor was the bass player, and he played upright. He had done other records with Tom, and they had a good relationship. Mark Ribot, R-I-B-O-T, had been working with Tom as far back as 1985's Rain Dogs, Tom's 8th album. He was also the guitar player from the Lounge Lizards, had recorded countless records. His eclectic sound suited Tom's music, but this would be the very first time they tracked a record together. Every other time they'd worked together, Ribot was brought in after the initial recording to be overdubbed. Les Claypool, the bass player from Primus, would come in later and put down tracks once Larry left. Tom's son, Casey, would play drums on a couple of songs and do some DJ record scratching. Tom asked Casey to go to San Francisco and pick up some vinyl, and he gave him $200. Casey came back from San Francisco with the vinyl, and Tom heard him pull it in. So he opened the door. I heard Tom yell, "Oh no!" I ran to see what had happened. Casey had put the vinyl in the back window of the car, and it had warped in the sun. It was all ruined. "I guess that's something we take for granted," Tom said. "We know about these things, but they don't get passed on down, so he wouldn't have known. We grew up with vinyl. It was common knowledge not to leave them in the sun." Tom had just finished the movie Coffee and Cigarettes with Iggy Pop. It was directed by Jim Jarmusch. Jim had apparently gone to Tom and told him that Iggy didn't like Tom's drummers. and then had gone to Iggy and said that Tom really didn't like his music, hoping to fire up some controversy and create dramatic tension on the set of the film. Is Jim Jarmusch like a hack? Is he like a cheap, like douchebag hack? I don't know. I really like Dead Man, but I've only watched it once. I think lots of people are good at like executing things a certain way, but man, like that zombie movie he did that I didn't see, so I can't really talk trash about it. It feels like the consensus was it was a big disappointment because he had all these great, like he seems like the kind of guy that could take a bunch of great elements and actors that want to work with him because he's probably fun for actors to work with, and then still crank out something that no one wants to watch, unless you're like a diehard Jim Jarmusch, fanboy. I don't know. I just feel like he's one of those guys that might be better for me, the selfish audience member, when he's constrained to a couple of ideas and he's, has a smaller cast and he's good at conveying some certain tones and certain ideas. But hey, maybe I'm just missing out. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, Jim. Jim, if you're listening to this, please call in. I'll keep the lines open all night if you want to call in and talk about stuff. Now, while I sit here and watch the phone lines for Jim's call, let me say thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself. Be nice to yourself. Thanks for giving a damn about rock and roll to the point where you'll listen to all this stuff that I've managed to pull from various visits to the library recently. Please tell a friend about the show. If you downloaded this MP3 instead of listening to it live in the browser window or whatever, share it. Throw it at a friend. Give it to somebody else. I would love that so much. Thank you.